To define what religious freedom is, we will rely on the most solemn declaration of the Conciliar Church in this matter, Dignitatis Humanae. This document, promulgated at the time of the Second Vatican Council, reveals perfectly the ins and outs of this doctrine. The first important thing we discover about it is the following. This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others within due limits. I have barely begun this presentation of the conciliar doctrine, yet I already must open a first parenthesis. You must know that the English translation of Dignitatis Humanae available on the Vatican's website is of poor quality. It is unreliable and therefore no one should rely on it. This passage is missing crucial information about the very principle of religious freedom. This is extremely problematic because it alters the very nature of this doctrine. Since only the Latin version of this document is officially recognized by the Conciliar Church, let us examine it to see what it really says. Haec Vaticana Synodus declarat personam humanam ius habere ad libertatem religiosam. Huius modi libertas in eo consistit, quod omnes homines debent immunes esse, a coercitione ex parte sive singulorum, sive coitum socialium, et cuius vis potestatis humanae, et ita quidem ut in re religiosa neque aliquis cogatur, ad agendum contra suam conscientiam neque impediatur, quo minus iuxta suam conscientiam agat privatim et publice, vel solus vel alis consociatus, intra debitos limites. In the English translation available on the Vatican's website, the Latin phrase neque impediatur quo minus iuxta suam conscientiam agat has simply disappeared. The correct translation of this phrase is as follows, or prevented from acting according to his conscience. Do not make the mistake of believing that this is a mere detail, because a correct translation teaches us that religious freedom is composed of not one, but two distinct elements. The first, as we have seen, is the right not to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, which we will translate from now on more correctly to the right to not be forced to act in a manner contrary to one's conscience. Assuming that it is here only a question of the freedom of the act of faith, then all the Catholics who are faithful to the tradition are in complete agreement with the Conciliar Church on this point. It is indeed unlawful to force someone to convert to the true religion against his will. Not only do we, critics of Vatican II, agree with the concept of the freedom of the act of faith, but we also consider its rejection a heresy. Let us now focus on the second component of religious liberty, the one that was simply deleted from the English version, the right to act according to one's own conscience, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others within due limits. This excerpt explicitly states that to prevent such a mode of action would be an illegitimate form of coercion. From a strictly grammatical point of view, and independently of its context, this statement is irreproachable. Indeed, if by due limits we are to understand just moral limits, then there cannot be anything reprehensible, because by definition justice would be done. Unfortunately, these supposedly due limits are purely fictitious, and I will provide formal proof of that. To complete this first excerpt, I would now like to draw your attention to a second passage. Therefore, the right to religious freedom has its foundation not in the subjective disposition of the person, but in his very nature. In consequence, the right to this immunity implied from coercion continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it, and the exercise of this right is not to be impeded, provided that just public order be observed. Religious freedom, on the grounds that it is an integral part of human nature, could not be taken away from an individual even if he does not live up to his obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it. This obligation that this excerpt deals with is obviously a moral obligation. Yet a person who does not fulfill a moral obligation is necessarily betraying his conscience. This is all the truer since making the effort to seek the truth is within everyone's reach. Such behavior consists only in acting with righteousness, using the means at one's disposal, and without any obligation of result. I insist on the fact that no excuse can be made for someone who despises this imperative, since God has taken the trouble to engrave it in the conscience of every person. If this were not the case, life would have no meaning for human beings, who would be nothing more than wandering animals waiting to return to dust. In the hypothetical case that he would still have to endure the torments of hell, his Creator could be held responsible for his fate. A reprobate who did not receive what he needed to save his soul from eternal suffering could indeed only be the victim of an unjust God. To consider such a possibility would, of course, be terrible blasphemy. Thus, if an individual has a right to religious freedom without even fulfilling the moral obligation to seek the truth and adhere to it once he knows it, this means, quite simply, that he is not required to act according to his own conscience to make use of all the rights recognized by Dignitatis Humanae. We could therefore rewrite the first excerpt in all honesty as follows. This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act against his conscience or prevented from acting according to his conscience or against his conscience, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with accomplices within due limits. Insofar as those with whom it would be licit to associate could also act against their conscience, calling them accomplices is legitimate. It is perfectly clear here that the conciliar church recognizes the right to religious freedom for all unconditionally and without ever considering the intentions of the individual. Since this doctrine would be founded on human nature, it is impossible to question this conclusion. Indeed, even the most diabolical intentions cannot change our nature. The worst pervert would therefore continue to enjoy all the rights recognized by Dignitatis Humanae, because no one could take away from him what would be founded on his own essence and not on a subjective disposition. Moreover, it is not written for those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it, but in those because religious freedom would not be a right granted arbitrarily by any authority, but an indissociable characteristic of mankind. What I highlighted so far is nothing other than the very principle of religious freedom. There is, therefore, a real problem, because the conciliar doctrine is not at all content to respect free will. It recognizes the right of every individual to do what he wants, regardless of his intentions, even though his actions could be seriously detrimental to others. Let us now consider the rights that Vatican II recognizes for every person, whether honest or dishonest, privately or publicly, alone or in association with others. The freedom or immunity from coercion in matters religious, which is the endowment of persons as individuals, is also to be recognized as their right when they act in community. Religious communities are a requirement of the social nature both of man and of religion itself. Provided the just demands of public order are observed, religious communities rightfully claim freedom in order that they may govern themselves according to their own norms, honor the Supreme Being in public worship, assist their members in the practice of the religious life, strengthen them by instruction, and promote institutions in which they may join together for the purpose of ordering their own lives in accordance with their religious principles. Religious communities also have the right not to be hindered either by legal measures or by administrative action on the part of the government in the selection, training, appointment, and transferal of their own ministers, in communicating with religious authorities and communities abroad, in erecting buildings for religious purposes, and in the acquisition and use of suitable funds or properties. Religious communities also have the right not to be hindered in their public teaching and witness to their faith, whether by the spoken or by the written word. In addition, it comes within the meaning of religious freedom that religious communities should not be prohibited from freely undertaking to show the special value of their doctrine in what concerns the organization of society and the inspiration of the whole of human activity. Finally, the social nature of man and the very nature of religion afford the foundation of the right of men freely to hold meetings and to establish educational, cultural, charitable, and social organizations under the impulse of their own religious sense. It is clearly manifest that the conciliar church recognizes to all false religions, without the slightest exception, the same rights as Catholicism. In society, false religions would be equal in every way to the true one. The only possible distinction would be purely intellectual and, of course, only interesting to those who would take the trouble to make it. On the other hand, if any person were allowed to use all the above prerogatives, even though he might be betraying his conscience and thus pursuing dishonest objectives, there would be absolutely nothing we could do to prevent him from acting wrongly. These due limits, if they exist, can therefore be of little use. Indeed, the rights conceded by dignitatis humanae, even without exceeding them, are more than enough to harm one's neighbor and society. As if that were not enough, the conciliar church does not hesitate to explicitly threaten those who would dare put up any resistance to its liberal policies. In Dignitatis Humanae we can also read, "Injury, therefore, is done to the human person and to the very order established by God for human life, if the free exercise of religion is denied in society, provided just public order is observed." We will return to this notion of just public order a little later, which, like these so-called due limits, is nothing but a vast deception. Understand for the moment that the expression religious freedom is a denomination referring to a set of rights recognized to any person, whatever their intentions may be. It is true that the freedom of the act of faith is technically part of religious liberty, but it is, in comparison to the rest, only a tiny element. There is no need to dwell on this aspect of the conciliar doctrine because no one questions it. Therefore, when we, Catholics who are faithful to tradition, criticize religious freedom, we are not rejecting the freedom to convert freely at all. We are, in fact, only referring to the immensity of rights that the conciliar church grants to anyone without even considering one's motivations to propagate anything and lead souls after this person astray.